What's up, everybody? We are live with the Awesemo Fanduel DFS strategy show. I am Matt Gajewski, here with Kyle Dvorchak, not my relative. You can follow me on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski, and you can follow him at Kyle Tweets Here. We are here today with a debut episode of the Fanduel DFS strategy show. This is a show focused entirely on breaking down the Fanduel slate. Thought we needed a little extra coverage here. Kyle, what is going on? I've been getting DMs left and right about me and you being related, pictures of us side by side, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. How you doing, man?
I'm not good because of this talk. It's not that I don't like you. It's not that I wouldn't like to look like you, because apparently I do. It just feels a bit disrespectful. I think it's the glasses. I think it's, you see two guys with glasses. We both have the scruff going on, and they're the same guy. They're like, it's the Office meme. There's no difference in these pictures. That's what it is. So giving some love to FanDuel today, because I know DraftKings gets a lot of the talk. Most of the big players are focused on DK, but I do think we should be focusing on FanDuel, just because it's still a good format. And interestingly, I think it's almost a better format in terms of 100-yard bonuses are quite difficult to predict. I think it's a more stable, almost predictable, other than touchdowns. It's kind of the one difference maker. And two, I think the action's a little better on FanDuel, if you ask me.
Yeah, and I mean, there is still a ton of overlapping between DraftKings and FanDuel. Yeah, so a lot of what we'll talk about will be applicable to both sites. If you do play on DraftKings, you can still listen to the show and get a lot of good takeaways. Our first topic, it's definitely applicable to both sites. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about some injuries that you might want to monitor going into the week. Some big pivot points. I think first and foremost, we need to talk the James Conner, Benny Snell situation. Obviously, Benny Snell is quite affordable on both sites, and particularly FanDuel. What are you doing with the James Conner, Benny Snell stuff? I know there is a lot of value on FanDuel this week, but we had Boston Scott last week. He tanked a lot of lineups. Do you think Benny Snell comes in with a little lower ownership, and are you willing to go back to a really cheap running back on this slate?
So I will say, I don't think assuming James Conner is out, which seems quite likely, that Benny Snell is quite the ironically quite the smash, as Boston Scott doesn't end up smashing. I don't think he's quite that level of play. It's good because he's a favorite, 7.5 point favorites, Pittsburgh over Denver, but I don't think he's going to have as much of a receiving split as we would have anticipated with Boston Scott, although it didn't end up working out. I don't think he just becomes this 3-down workhorse back. Jalen Samuel definitely gets a role in this offense when James Conner is out. What is that role? It's probably not cutting much into Benny Snell's between the tackles work, because Jalen Samuel kind of just like a tight end, H-back, running back hybrid type player. So for me, I don't think Benny Snell is the absolute lock in cash games. And it's probably also because, like you said, there's just a lot of value. There are a lot of, I would call them just straight up misprices on FanDuel this week that you can go to instead of him. I think he's a guy who I wouldn't be going 100% in GPP, and I don't think you have to play him in cash. He'd be a good play. I just don't think he would be the lock button of all lock buttons.
I agree with you, and I think ownership is reflecting this. If you look at Awesemo's ownership projections, right now Benny Snell is not coming in very high. This could be partially due to James Conner's status. We just don't know yet. But last week we saw Boston Scott. He was pretty clearly going to be one of the most owned players on the entire slate. So I don't think it's quite the same situation either. I agree with you. As far as some other injuries we're kind of monitoring going into the weekend, we have Chris Godwin popping up with a concussion. This is certainly going to influence the ownership on Mike Evans. Kenny Golladay still has not returned from his hamstring. And we saw Quintez Cephas see 10 targets. And one guy catching a little bit of steam is Brashad Perriman, Jamison Crowder. Surprisingly not practicing early in the week. Brashad Perriman is near the min. So a lot of people potentially pivoting to him as your punt play allows you a lot of really nice plays at the top. Are you really interested in the Godwin Evans situation, the Golladay Cephas situation, and the Crowder Perriman situation? Anything catch your eye there?
Yeah, I mean, I understand why you would want to go to Perriman. He's going to be a number one with a gap between him and the two. That you probably call it Chris Herndon, or I don't even know, Chris Hogan, a bunch of Chris's I don't want to play. But I also just don't want to play Perriman because his quarterback is Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold looked terrible. Adam Gase doesn't run a creative offense. I think he's a guy I could probably sit out on, despite there being a good points per dollar projection. I just don't see myself needing to go there, and I don't see really much upside. Maybe you can say Perriman has a lot of splash play potential, but I think really all we've seen from him was a few good games in this money printing Tampa offense last year, and then a horrible career before that. So I don't feel the need to get to him. I would be very interested in Mike Evans. Mike Evans, despite coming into last week, I think he came out and said there it seemed like there was about a 25% chance he played heading into last week, and then practices happened and he ends up being able to make it. He's clearly at a very hampered version of himself. But as the number one receiver against a terrible Carolina defense that cannot cover even like a Derek Carr led team, although they don't score the touchdowns, they all went to Josh Jacobs. You look at what that team did to Carolina. Despite me being a little conservative on how I'm projecting Tom Brady throughout the year, this is a great spot for him to bounce back in. Mike Evans as his big number one receiver would be very interesting. I also think maybe if the Evans ownership gets too high, Scotty Miller, a great pivot. And Quintez Cephas in the Kenny Golladay situation, worth monitoring. Not a guy I'm too excited about. Any of these guys pique your interest? I know we talked about Snell. I'm meh on the guys other than Mike Evans who'd be in a smash spot.
Yeah, I was really interested in Evans before the injury situation. He's priced up at 7,400 on FanDuel, so it's not like he's super cheap. The reason I liked him is I thought you were going to get a ton of edge as far as leverage goes with the ownership coming in a little bit heavier on Chris Godwin. Obviously, if Godwin's out, that's going to flip a little bit here. The other receivers, I'm definitely not as interested in. There's a strong case for Perriman as a complete punt play, but I think I'm with you on this. Someone asked in the chat if we would be willing to take Jalen Samuels or Anthony McFarland as a good pivot if the Snell ownership gets too high. I think there's just too many other good values on the slate to really play some of those fringy guys. So I don't think I'm ever going to really get to Samuels or McFarland on this slate. What do you think?
Yeah, that would be like a showdown style pivot where the variance in one single game maybe makes you consider it, but I don't think it's even necessarily that like there's a high leverage that if Snell completely bust, I don't think that guarantees that Samuel hits. So I think that's what we're looking for with leverage is if X doesn't happen, the field really gets crushed and I profit conversely. I think they could both bust or they could both have decent games. So for me, I think it's just a meh play. And then when you expand to the broader scope of the slate having a ton of value, I really can't see myself getting to those guys.
Yeah, I agree 100%. The nice thing about Perriman, he allows you to jam in some really expensive plays. And we'll be taking a position by position look at the FanDuel slate today. This will start with QB. One of the highest priced, chalkiest plays on the slate projects to be Lamar Jackson right now. He is sitting at 9,500. We just saw what he did to that poor Cleveland Browns secondary last week. I know Cleveland had a ton of injuries, but man, did Lamar look good. It's just at this point, he's starting to become quite prohibitive to the rest of your lineup. Are you still willing to take a shot on Lamar Jackson, or has he just gotten too expensive at this point?
Yeah, he's getting to a point where there are just running backs in, the 7 to 8K range, up to that 9K range even. I love a lot of the running backs there, and that really prevents me from also going Lamar Jackson. FanDuel doesn't give you bonuses, so his rushing, while it's good, doesn't have this like extra threshold of upside that you could get on a DraftKings. So for me, I'm probably paying down. I think you can still get exposure to Jackson by going a Marquise Brown or a Mark Andrews, but that's probably the exposure that I would have to him, not through Jackson himself.
Yeah, listen, this game has a really high total. It's at 52, but it has fallen to start the week. We're looking at Lamar Jackson right now coming in as the highest owned QB, or it looks like it's dropped a little bit. He's now the second highest owned QB in the Awesemo projections, just above 13%. With the price you're paying on him, I'm just not willing to get there at this point outside of just some game stacks. The player who's now eclipsed Lamar Jackson in ownership is Dak Prescott. And obviously that is the premier stacking game on this entire slate. It is the highest total. Are you willing to eat some Dak Prescott chalk? He's sitting at 8,300 on FanDuel.
Yeah, I think I started the week thinking. I started the week thinking that maybe people would be a little bit down on the Cowboys because they showed pretty poorly in week one. That is obviously not the case. So then I pivoted to, let's just go full contrarian and play no Cowboys. I think I'm moving back to having some exposure. I think this game just has such a high potential of shooting out. And then when you look at the pricing on FanDuel, it's pretty easy to get up to multiple of this team that I think, as opposed to completely fading it and just saying, if it doesn't hit, I win, I'm probably going to have some exposure. I think some of that will come through Dak Prescott. A lot of that will come through one-offs, though, just playing a single Michael Gallup and hoping he scores twice. The same could be said of Amari Cooper, even CeeDee Lamb. So I'm going to have some exposure to Dak Prescott, but I don't think I'm going to go crazy on him like it seems the field will.
Yeah, for sure. And on FanDuel specifically, we'll get to some of the other positions in a bit here, but Amari Cooper, Gallup, and CeeDee Lamb are all inside the top 6 of wide receiver ownership, which is pretty crazy to me. So we definitely like this game a lot. I think there's a lot of options you can just take in the lower price range, which is why maybe we're not as excited for your Lamar Jacksons, your Dak Prescotts. Even if you look down the list as far as pricing goes, Deshaun Watson is coming in with lower ownership. He's 7,900. And if you want to go even lower, there's a couple options around that high 6K, low 7K range I think you can target. I know you're particularly interested in this KC game. So why don't you talk to me about that a little bit?
Yeah, for me, that's a game that, especially on FanDuel, could just feature a lot of touchdowns specifically. There are so many playmakers in this game. People are going to be off of it seemingly solely because of Tyrod Taylor. And I agree, Tyrod Taylor, not a quarterback you generally want to be on. And season long, he seems like his ceiling is somewhat capped over the course of a season. But on an individual game, when he's losing by 2 touchdowns and dropping back every single play, that gives his teammates a lot of considerable upside. And his price is so small. I think he's a top 3 or 5 value at quarterback for us at Awesemo. And I think he has a path to, multiple touchdowns really is what you're looking for from Taylor. Taylor is cheap. You get a bunch of touchdowns. You get 2 touchdowns and you get them right. Say he throws one to Mike Williams and Eckler, and that's your stack. Hunter Henry could also play in there. I think he had 8 targets in week 1. If you get those touchdowns right, it basically opens up the entire slate for you to just go, I would say, both high priced and chalk elsewhere, because no one seems to be on Taylor. And this game seems to be just generally kind of going under the radar, despite it having so much touchdown upside. So it's got good value, shootout potential. I think all the pieces are here for it to be a good pivot and then let you go chalky elsewhere, let you get those running backs that you really want to get.
For sure. And I'm taking a glance at the ownership projections right now. It's not too often you see Patrick Mahomes coming in sub 5%, but that is the situation we have here. So I'm certainly interested in some Pat Mahomes stacks this week too. Another game that has a pretty decent total. We already talked about the Lamar Jackson side, but I want to get your take on Deshaun Watson here. He's at 7,900 on FanDuel. And I think people are discounting Watson a little bit just because we saw Baker Mayfield completely faceplant in this game last week. In a game with a really high total, are you interested in taking Watson as a contrarian option to Lamar Jackson?
Yeah, I think he's both contrarian to Jackson and the other high ownership, Dak Prescott, 'cause he's only 400 cheaper. So at a price point, he's a pivot off of Dak. And in the game, he is a pivot off Lamar. And I get it. The matchup is difficult. This Ravens defense is legit, one of the better defenses in the league. But Deshaun Watson is one of the best quarterbacks in the league. And if there's anything that Lamar Jackson himself, guys like Patrick Mahomes have taught us, it's that good offenses beat good defenses more often than not. That's just the way the NFL is structured today. So for me, when I can get both, a decent price and a good ownership discount on Deshaun Watson, I will be over the field on him and his weapons, specifically his explosive playmakers. A guy like Will Fuller is a guy I would love to pair him with. And that also still, like I said, opens you up. It gives you a pseudo exposure to Jackson. If Jackson goes crazy, Watson is going to have to go crazy if they want to keep in this game too. So I think it gives you exposure to Jackson without having to do it. And there's obviously great run backs on the other side. Like I said, Mark Andrews, Marquise Brown, even some sneaky plays, a Miles Boykin or a Willie Snead are in play, although it's very deep. That'd be a large field tournament play only.
For sure. Looking at GPPs exclusively with some of those guys. All right. I need you to talk me off a ledge with one player. Not someone I'm confident in, but someone great game environment. It's Dwayne Haskins at 6,500 on FanDuel. So Dwayne Haskins last week wasn't the greatest showing. 54.8% completion percentage, only 5.7 yards per attempt. That was 29th in the NFL. But he enters this really nice game environment against the Cardinals. It's a 47.5 total. That's been rising, which is something I like too. But what we saw to this Washington football team, I think this is an offense on the come up. They ran 70 plays last week. That was 9th in the NFL. They only had to pass 49% of the time. They were in shockingly positive game script. But Scott Turner is the OC. We saw him a little bit in Carolina, and we know he likes to run pass first and fast offenses. We know Arizona on the other side is going to run a pass first offense as well as a fast one too. So I think this could be a sneaky shootout with a lot of plays and a lot of points. It has me interested in Haskins. It has me interested in Terry McLaurin as a potential stacking partner. Am I crazy for considering Dwayne Haskins in tournaments this week?
No, I actually really like that call. He's a guy who in season long, I'm picking up my super flex leagues or trying to trade for him. I think this is a really good spot just because you look at his opponent, they're going to put up points. I think this offense in the Cardinals is going to go underrated, and how fast and how efficient they are going to be this year. That forces your opponents to attempt to do the same thing. And Haskins quietly, they got into the red zone 5 different times last week. only scored one time through the air. Peyton Barber gets a handful of goal line carries and punches them in. They also kneel it out in the red zone to basically they finish the game in the red zone, kneel it out, and give Carson Wentz one or two plays with 10 seconds left. It didn't matter at that point. 5 red zone trips and 1 passing touchdown. You could see that could have easily been 3 touchdowns for Dwayne Haskins. This offense going underrated in their ability to get in and score. I think he's going to be like this hero. No one's going to own him because he has this reputation as being ugly, but he could hit. It's a good spot for him to hit. There's great his offense is concentrated too. It's Terry McLaurin and Logan Thompson. That's like it, in my opinion, in terms of the receivers. So it's easy to pick out who you want to stack with. And then the run back options on the other side are great as well. I completely agree that this is a spot that it doesn't take much to be over the field on, and I think you should be over the field on.
Agreed. Well, before we close out on QBs, let's talk fades for a second here. We hit on a lot of guys already. We talked about potentially fading Lamar Jackson and Dak Prescott for price as well as ownership. Someone that's gotten a little bit of buzz that kind of surprised me was Mitch Trubisky. I don't know if this necessarily counts as a fade. You can't really go out to the public and be like, yeah, I faded Mitch Trubisky this week. I'm going to victory lap this, but he comes in 7,200. The reason I'm not too keen on Mitch Trubisky, just 56% completion percentage, 6.7 yards per attempt. I mean, against the Giants, I know their secondary is weak, but Chicago doesn't exactly have the flashiest offense either. They're passing 57% of the time. That's middle of the pack. They were in 65 plays, middle of the pack. I mean, there's just not a lot for me to get excited about this guy. What do you think about Trubisky? And are you fading anyone else specifically outside of the really expensive and chalky QBs?
Yeah, no, I completely agree on your sentiments on Trubisky. And I believe he had no touchdowns through 3 quarters. They were completely, I don't want to say they lucked into it. Like, it takes talent to produce touchdowns, but it was extremely convenient that they are able to score 3 touchdowns in the 4th quarter last week. If they don't do that, we're talking about Nick Foles at this point, probably. So for me, yeah, I'm just out on Mitch Trubisky. He's a talent. That means I won't have any of him. A guy I'm like, what is going on here? Ryan Tannehill is a top, what is this? He looks like our number 6 most owned quarterback on the slate. That's not crazy ownership. He's not, 15%, but I wasn't planning on having any Ryan Tannehill. Jacksonville defense is bad, but we also know that Tennessee, when they get up, they are going to jam Derrick Henry down their opponent's throats. This seems like a Tannehill 15 attempt game. Why are people, I just don't get this. Why are people excited to play Tannehill as he's going into a game like, yeah, I want my quarterbacks to be winning, so that means they put up points. They might be the exception. They're just going to run the ball.
Yeah, Tannehill's cheap. He's 7K flat on Fanduel. I think that's why people are looking at him, but it still doesn't really make sense to me. Phillip Rivers is 7,100. He completed 78% of his passes for 7.9 yards per attempt, which was 10th, over 300 yards, and he threw 46 times. I know that wasn't the best game script for them. They had to throw the ball a lot, basically. But it comes down to what you said. I don't expect Tannehill to throw a lot. And when there's pivots in that same price range, I'm not really going to be getting to him either. But let's talk about the running back position. We talked about not being too excited about some of the chalk at QB. But man, running back is a position where I am just licking my chops to get some of these running backs. And it starts with Jonathan Taylor. We're talking about Rivers. We're going to stick with the Colts here in the running back position. Jonathan Taylor's 5,800 on FanDuel. We know about Marlon Mack, goes down with the injury. Taylor comes out, starts the second half. It looks amazing. And more importantly, the guy sees 6 targets. People always questioning his pass game role at Wisconsin. So seeing him with those 6 targets was really promising to me. What do you expect from Jonathan Taylor this week? And do you think he fully assumes that Marlon Mack role?
Yeah, I do think he assumes the Marlon Mack role. I will say that, the presence of Hines behind him not only concerns me a little bit, but I think if you're playing in large field tournaments is actually it's interesting. I don't even like Hines that much. I love Jonathan Taylor. Hines to me is a guy who's, he's James White light. That's not that interesting, especially on half PPR FanDuel, but he's still a top 5 projected value at the running back position for us as of Thursday. For me, he's a guy you have to consider pivoting to, basically having as much value in terms of points per dollar as Taylor, but with, so little ownership relative to Taylor being one of the most popular plays on the slate. I still think Taylor's a fine play in cash. For me, I'm maybe looking to get off of him in tournaments. I still think it's okay to go chalky with guys like, Zeke and Henry. Taylor getting all the between the tackles work, but maybe if he just doesn't catch as many passes, he wasn't running nearly as many routes as Hines. He's a guy who I could see busting, and in his ownership, that's probably a reason for me to get off of him.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense in large field tournaments. Right now, he is going to be penciled into my cash lineup. And you spoke on his routes. He ran 12 routes total. That was on 26% of Phillip Rivers dropbacks. In comparison, Nyheim Hines ran a route on 60% of Phillip Rivers dropbacks. But we're seeing Taylor come in with such high ownership, partially because his price, 5,800,
It's good.
and that's going to afford you the roster mobility to go up and get some of these studs. And when we start looking at other running backs, Derrick Henry is a guy that saw immense workload. Ezekiel Elliott is someone in a similar situation in that highest totaled game on the slate. Do you have any interest in some of the chalky, expensive running backs? You know, Ezekiel Elliott going against the Falcons in that really high totaled game. Derrick Henry as a huge favorite against the Jacksonville Jaguars, both pushing 30% ownership right now.
Yeah, so it looks like to me that a lot of the builds on this slate are going to be cheapish running backs like a Jonathan Taylor, Kenyon Drake, another guy we have as a good value, also very popular, and then expensive quarterbacks like Jackson and Dak. I think I'm going to flip the script and eat the chalk at the expensive running backs, guys like Zeke and Derrick Henry, who both have multi-touchdown upside, 30-plus touch upside, especially with Henry in a spot where they're expected to ravage Jacksonville. Terrible defense, an offense that they played well last week, but still aren't expected to be world beaters. So I could see him easily getting, 25 to 30 carries. Had, I believe, 3 catches on their Monday night game as well. Darrynton Evans, I think is supposed to be back, but he's a guy who fumbled a bit in training camp. I don't think he's going to get a massive role heading into his first NFL game. So Henry and Zeke are guys that I'm probably looking to in large field tournaments. They are the guys I want to eat the chalk on. I like their touchdown upside on FanDuel. I think Jonathan Taylor has risks of busting. He's still a great play, but at his ownership, he has some ways to bust. And the quarterback prices at the top, or the quarterback ownership up top, just seems so crazy that I love the pivots down at quarterback. That gives me a lot of money. That gives me a lot of Derrick Henry and Zeke.
For sure. On the Derrick Henry catching passes, 3 targets, and he ran a route on 44% of Tannehill dropbacks. Darrynton Evans is back. So I'm not sure what his role is going to be, but I also want to say they were playing Jeremy McNichols out there, and Jeremy McNichols bouncing around practice squads. I'm not sure he exactly warranted snaps either. So I think if Darrynton Evans is back, like he probably gets on the field a little bit. I do think Ezekiel Elliott is in a fantastic spot, of course. We're kind of burying the lead here. We're talking about all these expensive running backs, and the man himself, Christian McCaffrey, his name hasn't even come up yet. He is priced egregiously on FanDuel this week. He is 10.5K. Is there a situation where you're playing McCaffrey? We know he has slate breaking ability. What are we doing with this price?
Yeah, this price, I just think when you can pay down, what is this, over 2,000 less for Derrick Henry, Derrick Henry could easily outscore McCaffrey. It would not surprise anyone if McCaffrey only finds the end zone once and just has a good, not great game. McCaffrey just needs to go so crazy on any given slate based on his price that I love the pivots down to Zeke, to Henry. There's even some lower price guys who I think could sneak up and score close to McCaffrey. One guy at 8K who I'm sure we'll talk about, I think has crazy touchdown upside. So for me, I just don't feel the need to pay up for McCaffrey on this slate.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. We've talked a lot about McCaffrey at this point, just being so cost prohibitive. It's hard to jam in some of the other studs you really need to win in this day and age in DFS. Now, you hinted at it. So we're going to move over and talk some low-owned plays at the running back position. We still have full slates here. There's no buys, anything like that. So we're getting most of the bell cow running backs on every single slate. There's guys like Saquon Barkley who project for 20 to 25 touches. And one guy in particular, you mentioned him. It is Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I don't know what is going on with this Chiefs team and ownership. Maybe this will change throughout the week, which is a good point too. Make sure you check ownership, update it throughout the week. But Clyde Edwards-Helaire specifically, 25 touches last week. All of those came on the ground. He was targeted twice, wasn't able to reel either of them in, but this was widely expected to be a timeshare with Darrell Williams, and we slowly see Edwards-Helaire pull away from this timeshare. By the end of the game, he's playing a majority of the snaps. Also ran a route on 52% of Mahomes' dropbacks. So if things go awry in this Kansas City offense, I do think Edwards-Helaire stays on the field against the Chargers, and he's the one likely to see those touches in the passing game as well. He also had a huge red zone role. I'll let you speak to that in a second. That could be another reason why this ownership is so low on Edwards-Helaire at 8K flat. But I love him here as a leverage play. What do you think about Edwards-Helaire?
Yeah, I would have, if you would have asked me following, let's call it Tuesday morning, if you would ask me Tuesday morning what I would project Clyde Edwards-Helaire ownership to be, given his 8K very affordable price, I would say it would be just below the guys like Elliott and Henry. I would say it's in that range of between like 18 to 22%. Right now, we have him coming in at 11. That's like half of what I would have expected. He had almost the entirety of the red zone looks. He doesn't end up converting. He had like 3 different drives where they got him involved in like inside the 5 to 10 yard line. Only ends up scoring once. Every expected points model you look at had him as one of not only the best running back plays, one of the best absolute quarterback, running back, wide receiver plays of the entire slate. He doesn't capitalize on all of those expected points. I think that's a bit of a fluke. When you have a Kansas City offense that has guys like Travis Kelce, Tyreek Hill, you are going to be spread out and trying to defend all these guys. That gives light boxes even inside the 5 or 10. It's so difficult to defend even Patrick Mahomes with his legs. This is an offense that is impossible to defend. That's going to open up red zone touchdowns for Clyde Edwards-Helaire. He's like 9.5K if he scores all 3 touchdowns. Such a variance-based thing like touchdowns for me. I think his price at 8K is so low. His ownership at right now about 10 to 11%, so low as well. If he had scored 3 touchdowns, we're talking about, do we play him at, the same price as Christian McCaffrey on Fanduel, where touchdowns are a bit more important as well. I just don't get how he's not the chalk of the chalk.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And guys in the chat, we're talking ownership a lot. If you're ever interested in seeing this ownership and you're not already a member at awesemo.com, make sure to head over to the site, check out that weekly NFL pass. You can find that at awesemo.com/join. We have packages available for players of all levels, recreational, professional. We have it all. So make sure to go check out that ownership. It's going to be important this week, especially with some of the injuries we're talking about, and that is going to change too. So make sure to hit on that. But Kyle, as far as the running back position goes, we talked about Edwards-Helaire. Are you willing to pivot anywhere else? Saquon is a guy I'm particularly interested in. I don't think we see Saquon average less than 1 yards per carry really at any point again in his career. That was pretty ridiculous. He's a guy that saw 9 targets in the passing game. He reeled in 6 of them, ran a route on 67% of Daniel Jones' dropbacks. What do you think about Saquon? And how about some other potential pivots? Anyone else you'd be looking at here?
Yeah, Saquon, another guy who shows up in every expected points model because he gets the volume. And despite me not liking the Giants offense, thinking, Chicago's defense is good as well, although I'm not big on caring too much about defensive matchups. I don't love the Giants offense, but I love touches above all else. Saquon getting those at such low ownership, he could have, we saw it at his peak. He does have Christian McCaffrey level volume. It just didn't come together on their week 1 performance. At 9K, I think that's a very reasonable price to pay for a guy with his volume. And it is ownership. It is a guy who, as much as I'm not excited about it, the strategy behind it just makes too much sense to not be over the field on Saquon just based on his volume alone. That gives him multiple touchdown upside. I don't love the offense, but I do love Saquon. His volume, his talent is all there. So I think he's a guy you have to consider. Austin Ekeler for me. I'm going to be talking about this Chargers offense way too much for how they looked in week 1, but I don't think that's necessarily what they're going to look like in week 2. They play, they played the Bengals in week 1. The Bengals couldn't even get to 20 points. You don't have to do a ton as an offense. When you're playing the Chiefs, you do have to at least try to do a ton. Austin Ekeler, even on Fanduel where his receptions aren't as valuable, I still think the yardage you gain from them and the touchdown potential you gain from them is quite valuable. We didn't see it in week 1, but he was running. He basically played on almost the entirety of their passing down snaps versus I think Justin Jackson had 7 and Josh Kelly had 3. And I don't know if either of those guys even ran routes. I think they were like blockers on those. So for me, Austin Ekeler at 6,900. People are going to say that the sky is falling because Joshua Kelly gets a handful of carries. Austin Ekeler gets, I think, 1 target that he converted to a catch. I still think Austin Ekeler is a talented player in a good situation as a clear passing down back against a Chiefs team that is going to eviscerate the Chargers. So there are going to be a lot of passing downs. I don't think you have to be really that high on him either to get over the field. So he's a guy I'm going to stack with Tyrod Taylor. I think there are other options on this offense as well. And then the run backs. We talk about a guy like Clyde Edwards-Helaire. We'll talk about some other run backs as well. I just think this game in general is such a good game environment, and the prices, the ownership are all there for it as well.
Yeah, definitely. I like Ekeler a lot in this sort of game environment. I know people are really quick to jump to conclusions saying Phillip Rivers is gone. The targets are drying up for Ekeler. Maybe they are. It's a 1 game sample, but we did see Ekeler as the only running back running routes for that team. Joshua Kelly did not run a single route. But before we move over to wide receiver here, let's talk some quick fades. We talked about a lot of guys we like. I want to know if there's anyone you don't like. One person in particular for me is going to be Ronald Jones. I know I'm going to piss Laffy off if he sees this show. Ronald Jones is his boy this week, but Ronald Jones, he's 5,900. I think that's a big reason why people like him. 19 touches last week. He only played 47% of the snaps. The reason I'm not too keen on Ronald Jones is I think we start seeing a touch squeeze from 2 sides at some point this year. they signed Leonard Fournette. Now, I don't think Leonard Fournette is a premier running back by any means, but I do think he's going to factor into this offense. He's only been with the team for a small portion of time right now, and he should squeeze Ronald Jones just from carries alone. Then we see LaShawn McCoy. He ran a route on 49% of Tom Brady's dropbacks. That was really close to what Ronald Jones ran. Ronald Jones was only running routes on 46%. So it's not like Ronald Jones was commanding this massive lead as far as pass game work either. So I think in the long term, playing a guy like Ronald Jones, over a Jonathan Taylor just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. What do you think about Jones and anyone else you're fading at RB?
Yeah, Jones's price is really good, 5,900, but I agree his ownership is he's another guy who I like. I actually do like both as a talent, and I like his projection this week. But at his ownership, when you have such obvious ways that this guy could bust, like if he just doesn't get the red zone work, he could go 10 for 100 and not catch a pass, and that is such a useless 100 yards for you. So for me, when a guy has so many paths to busting and his upside seems a bit capped, even at 5,900, I get the projection is probably good, but his ownership, he's a guy I'll just come in a bit lower on than the field on. Christian McCaffrey, we talked about him up top. His price just prices you out of getting a ton of good mid-range guys. I'm probably going to be basically below the field on him every single week, and I think that's a small plus advantage, plus EV edge you can take every week. It's just coming in below the field on CMC, unfortunately, because I love him, but the price is too much.
Yeah, for sure. I'm basically only playing CMC in complete game stacks where I really like the total when he's involved at this point. So I do usually have CMC, but I'm often below the field as well. But I'm taking a look in the chat. We have nearly 150 people watching the show. First of all, thank you guys. Second of all, if you could hit that thumbs up button, that would mean a great deal to me and Kyle. It is the best way to support us and everyone over at Awesemo.com. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell. That way you know when everything goes live on the channel. We would greatly appreciate it. But we need to talk wide receivers. So we'll hit on Davante Adams in a second. I actually have, I think, a more pressing question. It's the Cowboys wide receivers. Amari Cooper, Michael Gallup, CeeDee Lamb are all inside the top 10 in projected ownership. What do we do with this? Do you play just one? Do you play multiple in your cash lineups? In tournaments, do you fade entirely? I can't remember the last time I saw 3 wide receivers from one team this highly owned.
Yeah, it's crazy. I'm surprised even like CeeDee, like Amari doesn't surprise me. It's not surprising that he gets as the most popular, one of the most popular receiver plays. But to get all 3 of them in is actually absurd. I think the worst possible thing you could do is play a solo stack of Dak and Amari. You just gain nothing over the field. If they go off, you're competing with basically everyone who owns them is going to be a quarter of the field or something like that, 15% ownership of this stack. I would consider stacking them I would consider playing them as Michael Gallup, a single run back on the Atlanta side, and then moving on. CeeDee Lamb probably has that same type of potential where he could just catch 2 touchdowns and dry up the touchdown pool for his teammates. Or I think you have to go all in. I think the worst way to attack it is middle. Don't try and play the middle and say Amari Cooper is the only one and Dak is the only one. You gain no leverage by doing that. I think you either go absolutely all in on this team. You either triple stack or maybe you find a way to do Dalton Schultz even as a guy who could just luck box a touchdown at a low price. But the worst way is to middle. So I would say that's the biggest takeaway is don't go in the middle, either go all in or go very minimal. Hope Michael Gallup scores twice and you don't need anyone else, kind of like Calvin Ridley was last week. He gets the 2 scores and outshines his teammates. That's how I would approach it. I'm starting to think, though, that maybe you just have to, do you just have to get off this game in terms of you gain nothing if it goes off or you gain little if it goes off? How do you approach this? I'm kind of lost.
Yeah, so I
This is
just want
insane.
to, yeah, it is. It is for sure. I want to specify we're talking about tournaments in that situation. As far as cash goes, things like that, Amari Cooper's a fantastic play, and he'll be highly owned for a good reason. I think one thing you could do, just completely game stack it. We're still seeing complete game stacks coming in under owned compared to the amount of time they actually finish in that top 1 percentile of lineup. So if you want to run, I don't know, Dak, Cooper, Gallup, and then run it back with someone on the other side, I still think you probably have a little bit of an edge there. But you mentioned it, with all of them coming in with such high ownership, I am too questioning what that is. We'll see how this evolves throughout the week. But right now I'm looking at being a little light on Dallas. I mean, as crazy as that sounds in the kind of game environment we're expecting against Atlanta, but let's talk Davante Adams. I mean, Michael Thomas is hurt now. It seems like Davante Adams is the guy everyone's just penciling into that target hog role. people were really prioritizing Michael Thomas last year. Davante Adams is 8,600, so he is expensive, but he's still not cost prohibitive like Christian McCaffrey or
Mhm.
Lamar Jackson. Do I just have to play this guy?
Yeah, he's actually, the fine chalky play for me. I'm just going to say that when you can get that amount of targets on a guy like Davante Adams, who also has great touchdown upside, because even if Aaron Rodgers does look like he has in the past few years, his touchdown rate seems like something that is always going to be above league average. You can capture a lot of touchdowns by playing Davante Adams. You get a ton of targets. I don't see why you'd move off this guy. He's the one chalky play that I am just willing to eat that chalk on, even in tournaments, because Adams is upside. Adams is Michael Thomas. He is Michael Thomas. And now that we have no Michael Thomas, he's our only Michael Thomas. So when you can get this amount of targets for an affordable, not prohibitive price of 8,600, I'm totally on board with that.
There's just too many good things to say about Davante Adams. If you want to look at the matchup, they're playing the Detroit Lions. That's a 49.5 total. That's been rising steadily throughout the week. Detroit, they were just absolutely decimated by injuries last week. Desmond Trufant leaves the game with a hamstring. Justin Coleman lands on injured reserve. CJ Moore limited at practice with a hamstring himself. They were literally playing Darrell Roberts, Tony McRae, and Amani Aruwariye to finish out that game. We'll have to see the practice reports throughout the week to see what happens with this Detroit secondary, but we could be just looking at another absolute smash spot for Davante Adams and Aaron Rodgers. But, if you are looking to get contrarian, I do think there's a couple options. We see a lot of receivers on this slate in particular with a lot of target volume that are coming in with low ownership. On explosive offenses too, there's guys like Tyreek Hill, who stands out to me, coming in sub 10% ownership. I can't remember the last time you get Tyreek Hill, and not to mention he's just 8K flat, a guy with immense GPP winning potential, this cheap of a price at this low ownership. What are we doing with guys like Tyreek Hill, and can we look to anyone else?
Yeah, I'm looking at our ownership, and the amount of, I'm not going to give all the goods away, but the amount of the Atlanta Dallas game that is in our top ownership, it's like the entire game. I do think you have to have a lot of just entire fades of that game. You have to consider the option that this game, just for whatever reason, somebody gets hurt, Dak gets hurt or whatever, he's running, gets hurt. This game kills so much of the field if that happens. So for me, Tyreek Hill at under 10% ownership is an incredible pivot in that 8K range, basically falls into that, just above those guys, falls in that Julio Jones type of range. A guy is going to be popular. So Tyreek Hill, even Sammy Watkins, I would just look to find ways to get off the game that is going to basically be on everyone's mind. And Tyreek Hill, with his touchdown upside, his explosive play upside, is like the ideal pivot in this scenario.
I agree. He's someone that was kind of outshined by Sammy Watkins, as funny as that is to say, in week 1-2. But I'm looking at other games that just have high totals here. This Atlanta Dallas game is 52.5. This Baltimore Houston game is 52. But then outside of that, we have Detroit Green Bay at 49. We talked about Davante Adams a lot. I think the Carolina Tampa Bay game at 47.5 is really interesting. We touched on Chris Godwin, Mike Evans at the top, but even a guy like DJ Moore, who didn't really separate himself from some of the other receivers in Carolina. He's coming in at 6,800 on Fanduel. I think there's a lot of reasons to like him in what projects to be a really pass-friendly and fast game just because of the new OC and Joe Brady. So I do think there's a lot of ways to pivot off some of the chalky receivers as well. Is there anyone else in particular you're looking at as maybe a pivot or a leverage play at wide receiver?
So I'll quickly touch on my favorite game. Mike Williams led his team in targets, led his team in air yards. He's a guy that basically needs 2 to 3 plays to get it done. One other guy that I know you love and I've been all aboard is Juju Smith-Schuster, 7,100. Not a bad price for a guy who clearly is Deontay Johnson got more targets, but Juju Smith-Schuster has this history of being a dominant receiver in the NFL. Last year, a miserable year aside, his first years of his career were incredible. We see him find the end zone in week 1. This offense is looking clearly to be on the turnaround. Now their running game is looking quite scuffed with James Conner almost certainly being out. I could see them moving to a bit more of a pass-heavy approach, and we know that's in their range of outcomes. We saw 5,000 yards through the air from Ben Roethlisberger last time he was healthy. We could see something akin to that this season with their miserable running back room or the injuries they've suffered. So I love Juju Smith-Schuster at 7,100. I'll be playing him at this price point all day.
All right. I have, I think, the ultimate leverage play right now. And so you're going to have to explain this one to me. I can't quite figure it out. It's back in that Indianapolis game. Now, Paris Campbell, he's coming in sub 5% ownership. Paris Campbell is also incredibly affordable. He's 5,300. He finally plays a full-time role in this offense, plays 82% of snaps. More importantly, he ran a route on 83% of dropbacks. And the dude sees 9 targets. That was a 19.6 target share. He also added in a rush attempt, if you want to factor in things like that, just a little extra way to get the ball. 37% of Indianapolis's air yards. They're playing this Minnesota secondary that just got absolutely decimated by Green Bay last week. Why is Paris Campbell so low owned, and why should I not just jam him?
Yeah, it's super funny because I wasn't really in on Campbell or this offense that much last week. And typically, when you get proven wrong like that, it happens like in a dramatic fashion. If you were wrong on Devontae Adams, you can't go back to week one. Now he's the most popular play on the slate borderline. You can go back to week one with Paris Campbell. Apparently, no one saw what happened week one. You have a second chance. I don't know why. I don't know why you wouldn't take that. I'm given a second chance, and I'm going to be. It's not hard to be over the field on Paris Campbell. You don't typically get people just completely writing off a performance like we saw from Campbell. Apparently, in his price, 5,300. You mentioned it. That's such a low price for his target volume. I've been given a second chance by the grace of God to not miss out on the Paris Campbell breakout season, and I'm going to be doing that in week 2.
Yeah, listen, there's a lot of reasons to like Paris Campbell. He's giving you incredible leverage off a guy like Jonathan Taylor, who might be the most owned running back on this slate. And when we look at the overall game environment, a 48.5 point total that's rising throughout the week. It's also a close spread. Indianapolis is favored by 3. That does favor Jonathan Taylor, but it's not like it's this egregious game script like, I don't know, the Tennessee Jacksonville game where we just expect Derrick Henry to run everywhere. We just saw Phillip Rivers attempt 46 passes last week. Jacksonville, I know they're like a great matchup for Derrick Henry, but I don't know why you just don't pivot to this kind of matchup here and take Paris Campbell, take all of your Colts. Really, I love Jonathan Taylor still, but I still think you can get some incredible leverage with Paris Campbell in this situation. Any other leverage we may have missed here? I know I like Terry McLaurin a lot. We talked about the Dwayne Haskins stack, so that's what I'm potentially looking at. But anything else catching your eye at wide receiver before we pivot to tight end?
Yeah, I will say Will Fuller is still going to garner some ownership, but at 6,100 for the number one Deshaun Watson receiver, he's a guy like he falls in that range of middle ownership, the just on the border of single to double digits. And with so much ownership concentrated at top, I also think at the price point, he's the exact price pivot off of Michael Gallup, who's $100 cheaper. But for me, Will Fuller as his team's number one receiver, as opposed to Gallup being the number two, I will be having a lot of Will Fuller in a game that has another high total. It just seems to be going basically second fiddle to the Atlanta-Dallas game. So I'm trying to find ways to pivot off, and Will Fuller at the price point is the perfect way to do that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I love Fuller. We saw him actually work as an alpha in that offense. It was really promising to see for him long term. And I think that's a very nice situation to target Fuller as an underdog too. But let's move over to tight end. We hit on a lot of wide receivers already. The tight end position is really interesting on Fanduel. We don't see quite the differences between, the highest priced tight ends and the cheapest tight ends. So there's a lot of guys kind of wedged in the middle of the pricing tier. I think it actually kind of spreads ownership out a little bit, and we are seeing it on the site. Right now, Mark Andrews is projected to be the most owned tight end. I think that's for very good reason. We actually saw him play 71% of snaps, and your tight ends, especially tight ends that are catching passes, you're probably more concerned with routes run, but we never saw Mark Andrews near that 70% share last year. So just functioning as more of a full-time player in this offense, he saw 28.7% of the air yards for Baltimore. They were an incredibly positive game script. So this could be a small sample trap, but I don't know. I'm having a lot of trouble getting away from him at 7,500, especially with some of the value on the slate. You play a guy like Paris Campbell, you play a guy like Jonathan Taylor. It's not exactly very hard to jam in Mark Andrews. What do you think about him as the most owned tight end?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I will say that, Travis Kelce for only 300 more. I'm surprised they're not a little closer. There's a bit of a discrepancy between the two in ownership, but Mark Andrews does make sense. You mentioned it. He turned from last year being a very effective, but almost a role player in a sense, to now it seems like with the loss of Hayden Hurst being traded to Atlanta, he is absolutely the guy. He's basically the number one receiver on this team for a team led by Lamar Jackson, who seemingly does not know what regression is. I think he was like a 12% touchdown rate last week. So for me, this is a spot where I think I would prefer to play Mark Andrews in. For me, it's going to be a lot of Deshaun Watson stacks. I like to run him back in that way, but I think you can even play him solo just because he has so much touchdown upside. We saw it last week with 2 touchdowns. That's easily within his range of outcomes, again, in a game that should feature a lot of points versus the Texans. So he's a guy that I think is a good enough play. I do think there's some efficacy to the Travis Kelce pivot though.
100%. You're getting nearly a 5% ownership break by pivoting down to Kelce. George Kittle, he's not expected to play this, or excuse me, he's not expected to practice this week, but Kyle Shanahan did say he's expected to play. He's in that price tier. I think he'll carry a little bit of ownership, but if he's inactive, I think it'll bump up both Andrews and Kelce, probably as well as Ertz, who's coming in just behind these guys. And I mean, people don't treat Ertz like he's the wide receiver one for Philadelphia, but convince me if I'm wrong here. I firmly believe Zach Ertz is the wide receiver one for this Philadelphia team. 85% of snaps, 74% of routes run, 7 targets. I know that was behind Dallas Goedert, who you coined as the real tight end one for this team. But why should I not just save the extra money and go right down to Ertz?
Yeah, I think Ertz would be a fine tournament pivot over guys like Mark Andrews and Travis Kelce because he has the same target upside. I'm not sure if the touchdown upside necessarily there. We saw Carson Wentz struggle greatly in week 1. It was against a stacked front 7, at least from the Washington football team defense. So I think maybe that's probably why his ownership is much lower. You just don't get the high flying offense that you get when you buy into a Kansas City or a Baltimore. And as much as I like to rag on Ertz because Dallas Goedert is a supreme talent, as of right now, I still agree. Zach Ertz is the number 1 receiver. Could that change? Could a young, athletic tight end like Dallas Goedert eventually overtake him? Yes, but as of right now, I agree. It's still Zach Ertz as the number 1. So I think he's a fine pivot, although I do think I get some concerns with the Philly offense. So that's why I think his ownership is where it is. I'm probably going to be with the field or lower just because of that. I think you get a ton of upside, especially touchdown upside, when you pay that extra, $1,500 for Travis Kelce. It's a bit of a payment, but I think it's worth the payment to get up.
Right. We're talking 6,300 for Ertz. So it's not like he's still expensive. He's just not in that, I don't know, egregious top tier range for tight ends. But we've only talked expensive tight ends at this point. We know not everyone's going to go there. Some people, just the way their roster construction is naturally built, they're going to have to pay down for tight end. It's looking like the premier punt option on the slate is Dalton Schultz, who was left at 4K. I don't know if Fanduel might have missed this role change or not, but Dalton Schultz is 4K playing for the Dallas Cowboys in that highest total game on the slate where we know everyone is going to target. Schultz, he comes in, plays 69% of snaps, runs around on 53% of Dak Prescott dropbacks. Those are both really promising considering Jarwin started this game and he's now out with a season-ending injury. At 4K flat, are you playing Dalton Schultz or is this another Cowboy situation where you're fading based on ownership?
Yeah, his ownership, he's going to be technically one of the higher owned plays on the slate, but basically there's like a top tier of 2, another tier of a handful of guys, and then you get to this giant flat tier of ownership. So I think he is absolutely a fine play, and he's got to be, even though he's going to be one of the higher owned tight ends, he's still not that crazy high ownership. He's got to be a way to make your Dak Prescott stacks different. I would make him a priority. I would boost him in your projections in lineups that have Dak. If you're using Cruncher, you can boost him in Dak lineups. So for me, he's a guy that I don't love him. I think he's mostly an inline blocker. But if he's going to be on the field for almost the entirety of their snaps, he has a chance. He has multiple touchdown upside. Even 1 touchdown at 4K is enough. He's a great way to get your Dak stacks different. Outside of that, I'm probably leaving him off the table.
For sure. I agree with that. I am very interested in Schultz at 4K flat, particularly in cash games. What does this guy have to do to really pay off that salary? You also have to think about who he's affording you in the rest of your lineups. Can you maybe make that jump to get up to a safe play like Christian McCaffrey in your cash lineups if you roster Dalton Schultz? It's at least a question to think about, I think, going forward. But we have nearly 200 of you in the chat. Hit that thumbs up button. Try to support me, Kyle, and the entire Awesemo team. It is the best way to do so on here, the easiest way to do so. But say you're not paying up for tight end. Say you're not paying down for Dalton Schultz. In tournaments, where are you most likely to go to find that leverage? We know this is a volatile position, highly touchdown dependent, a position I'm very willing to fade some chalk at. Where are you looking?
So this is mind-boggling to me. Dallas Goedert, 5,500. Why is no one on this? He's supposed to be less than 1%. I
knew you were going to do this. I knew it.
This is, and we talk at the top of the tight end conversation. I'm not saying Dallas Goedert is immediately the number 1 tight end, but for the discrepancy in his ownership versus Zach Ertz versus any of the guys in his price range versus, like, people are going to be more on Gronk at 54 for please God, pay $100 more and get a 10 times better tight end in Dallas Goedert. I think his price is fine. He's not super cheap, but he's fine in that mid range. And just the fact that guys like Higbee, like Hawkinson, I expect Dallas Goedert, he's the number 2 or like the 2B receiver on this team. I don't get how his ownership is just so much lower than like dusty old Rob Gronkowski, who is probably going to beat out by OJ Howard at some point. It just blows my mind, the ownership discrepancy. I don't think he's like the lock of all locks, but my God, people.
Yeah, I mean, this Philly team is running 12 personnel at an extremely high rate. It's similar to last year when the receivers were all banged up. They're starting to get healthier, but I still think we see heavy dosages of 12 personnel in their offense. I mean, Goddard played 79% of snaps last week, 9 targets, leads the team. At 5.5K, I think people still have this perception, Dallas Goedert functioning as the tight end too. He's not worth this price. So that could be a reason why his ownership is potentially depressed. As far as, other sort of leverage pivots go, there's a lot of interesting names, tight ends that I think will see volume, but aren't necessarily your safest plays. One is Evan Ingram. He's 6K flat, so he's also not very attractive as far as price goes, but he's playing for a Giants team. He ran around a 90% of Daniel Jones dropbacks, essentially functioning as a top 3 pass catcher on that team. We know Golden Tate is still banged up, and he saw 7 targets. It was an 18% target share. So he's someone just with his pass catching prowess I'm interested in. A guy, like Mike Gesicki stands out in a really tough matchup, but someone you could maybe also get a break on ownership with. Jack Doyle is cheap. I know he popped up on the injury report, so we'll have to watch his status, but there's a lot of options at tight end. Who else would you maybe be looking to for leverage here?
Yeah, Logan Thomas led his team in targets, led his team in air yards, and was 3rd in skill position snaps on the team. 4,700 is a very affordable price in a game that has a reasonably high, I believe I last saw them at 47 versus Arizona. That total is attractive, and it's in the spot where I think it's not going to garner the ownership relative to its upside. You already talked about liking Dwayne Haskins. I just think that he makes sense in a range where there's a lot of guys, Jonnu Smith around that same ownership and price range. We see a little bit cheaper Dalton Schultz, a little bit more expensive TJ Hawkinson. I think he falls in that sweet spot of where I'm trying to pay down, not entirely, not a complete punt for Dalton Schultz, but he's still cheap. His ownership is going to be probably sub 5%. I don't think he's the best pivot. Like, I don't, he's still got some ownership. People aren't completely writing him off, but in that range, he's probably my favorite play of the price range and of the ownership range.
I agree. I like the ownership a lot there as well. As far as fades at tight end, I think it's harder to make the case for a lot of these guys just because it's a really touchdown dependent position. I'm going to kind of go off the board. I have a really strong feeling I know who you're going to talk about. So I want to touch on TJ Hawkinson for Detroit. He's not a really strong fade for me. He's just a guy I really question his role after seeing the week 1 snap shares. 64%, only ran 28 routes. That was a route on 60% of Matthew Stafford dropbacks. He does have the 5 targets. That's a 12.2% target share. So those numbers aren't egregious. He's priced at 5.6K. He's right around guys like Goddard, who I certainly prefer over Hawkinson. So I just want to point out that I'm typically not getting to a lot of Hawkinson in my build. So as far as when we talk fades, he's a guy that's probably going to be a fade for me just by default of me liking other players more in his price range. Is there anyone you're downright fading this week at tight end?
Yeah, assuming he plays, I'm still going to be off of George Kittle. This is going to be one of the most miserable game environments.
You didn't take my guy.
No, right. Are you talking Zach Ertz?
No, I'm talking Chris Herndon, but go ahead, talk about Kittle.
Oh, Chris Herndon. Are people on Chris Herndon? I'm not playing Chris Herndon. Are you kidding me? I'm not playing any part of this game. So the fact that George Kittle if he plays, drawing some ownership, he left at some point. I think he left before halftime in the first game. He just doesn't appear to be healthy. If people are going to be on him at his crazy price, like paying that much for George Kittle, your opportunity cost is pretty high in terms of you could pay down like nearly 3,000 to get Logan Thomas. You can pay down 3,400 to get Dalton Schultz. So you commit a lot of your salary to him. And then he's coming in, in that 7 to 10 ownership range. He could sink your entire lineup on his own if he comes out and just is not able to play. And even if he is, the game environment is miserable. It's not a game I want to be targeting. So for me, he's just an easy guy to write off, assuming he plays. And obviously, if he doesn't, don't play him. Outside of that, Jonnu Smith, I talked about fading Ryan Tannehill. I'm by that measure, I'm totally fading Jonnu Smith. When Anthony Ferguson and Mike Hoyle-Pruitt are threats to your touchdown upside and your team is a giant favorite and all they want to do is run the ball, I just can't imagine playing Jonnu Smith, 4,900. I am absolutely pivoting, saving $200, saving a little bit of ownership, and playing Logan Thomas over him every single time.
Yeah, I agree with those two fades. I thought you were going to say Chris Herndon. Now, Chris
He's
Herndon,
he's off my radar. I haven't thought of Chris Herndon in at least 48 hours.
his ownership came in a little higher yesterday. I think these numbers have changed at this
Yeah.
point, but his ownership has dropped probably just because he's 5,100. You can play guys like, I don't know, Dalton Schultz for a fraction of the price, but just to back up this Herndon fade, he only ran a route on 56% of Sam Darnold dropbacks. I mean, do you really want to roster a player on the team with the lowest total every single week on an Adam Gase-led offense? The answer for me is a resounding no. So I think we'll leave the tight end position at that. Let's talk some bold calls before we get out of here. Let's give the people what they want on FanDuel. What is going to take down that crucial GPP win for these people on FanDuel this weekend? What are you looking at as far as bold calls?
I'm going to say Tyrod Taylor, apparently my guy. I've been periodically dipping my toes into going to bat for him the whole show. Tyrod Taylor, I'll say scores multiple touchdowns. I think he has upside with his legs as well. So he scores multiple touchdowns and is a top 3 value at the quarterback position. And he allows you to do so much. So I'm going to go to bat for Tyrod Taylor, multiple touchdowns, could throw, could rush. He's a guy I'm trying to get in my lineups.
Yeah, to the Tyrod Taylor point, I think a lot of people expected this team to run super slow. They actually showed a lot. They ran with a decent pace. They were 8th in plays per game. They ran 71. And, they played with a lead for a large portion of this game. I believe Cincinnati scored first, but then after that, LA played with the lead for a large portion of this game. They weren't throwing the ball, and that makes sense. You never really expected this team to throw the ball. But like you mentioned, Tyrod Taylor does add in some ability with his legs. So I'm certainly interested at Tyrod Taylor. He's 6,800. So this is another reason why you might not want to play a guy like Lamar Jackson at 95. You're paying literally a fraction of the price for Tyrod Taylor. So I'm hoping they keep up that quick pace. We know they're going to have to try to keep up with the Chiefs. So I'm certainly interested. But for my bold call, you're going to have to talk me off this Dwayne Haskins and Terry McLaurin stack. And maybe we can touch on the Arizona side of this too before we get out of here. We didn't really talk about the Cardinals a lot, and they will carry some ownership, so we should hit on that too. But as far as the Dwayne Haskins, Terry McLaurin stuff goes, we talked about the pace for Washington, a team that played surprisingly fast. I think they'll be pass heavier when they're in negative game script. Again, just 49% pass last week when they were surprisingly playing with the lead. We know the Cardinals are going to play fast. They're a team that allows 7.4 yards per attempt. Dwayne Haskins is 6,500, so you're also affording yourself the ability to jam in a bunch of studs at the top. As far as Terry McLaurin goes, Logan Thomas kind of outshined him in week 1, but Terry McLaurin still ran a route on 100% of Dwayne Haskins dropbacks, 23.5% target share, nearly 30% of Washington's air yards. It's a situation that I want to target. And if you want to look at complete game stacks, you have DeAndre Hopkins, you have Kenyon Drake, you have Christian Kirk. There's a ton of options on the other side. We didn't talk about Kyler. He's 8K on the slate. I think he's another nice option if you were to target the Arizona side of this and maybe use like McLaurin as a run back. But what do you think about this game and the Haskins-McLaurin call?
Yeah, I like that call a lot. I think this game is going to go. I think apparently every game is going to go underlooked relative to the obvious Atlanta Dallas smash spot. So any way I can just pivot and find a unique game to stack, I absolutely love it. And I like the Washington side of things. It should be a good matchup versus the Cardinals. And they're, like you mentioned, great run back options. We have Kenyon Drake as a phenomenal value at 6,600 this week. DeAndre Hopkins, an absolute target animal in week 1. So the run backs are great. The Washington side is going to go completely underlooked relative to I like their condensed target tree. If you get Terry McLaurin and Logan Thomas, you can get most of their targets. So I think this is a great spot to get different on the slate. I like the bold call.
I have one more, and I want to ask you a question on this. I kind of like Raheem Mostert. 60% of snaps, 18 touches. There's some steam in the chat as well about Raheem Mostert. I don't think Tevin Coleman and Jerick McKinnon play a large role, and they're playing the Jets. Like, should Raheem Mostert have more ownership? I kind of think he should.
Yeah, what other options does this team have to do if George Kittle doesn't end up playing or plays at a hobbled capacity without Debo, potentially without Brandon Ayuk? What else do they do? How do they not run the ball on, 2/3 of their plays or more? And they're touchdown favorites. It is, and the line was actually moved at one point in their favor as well. It seems like this is actually another great spot to get on Mostert, and not a film guy. The dude looks like fast. He was electric on his reception, man. He's the real deal. I think he's going to get the majority of his team's carries. We saw that in week 1. He greatly outtouched his backfield compatriots. So for me, in a smash spot against a terrible Jets defense where they're big favorites and they have no other options at this point but to run the ball. Mostert is another great pivot option off some of the running back chalk. I really like that.
Well, Kyle, thanks. That'll do it for the show today. Guys, we have 200 of you in here. Hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell so you know when we're live. Follow myself at Matt_Gajewski. Follow him, Kyle, at Kyle Tweets here. And make sure to go to Awesemo.com. Sign up for that NFL Weekly Pass. It is at Awesemo.com/join. Thank you guys all for joining us today. Had a lot of blast breaking down the Fanduel DFS slate on our Fanduel DFS show, our inaugural episode. We'll be back again next week, and thanks a lot, guys.